I think everyone in the world is always looking for their identity. And because our identity changes all the time, depending on what happens in our environment, we are always trying to find out who we are. My name is Thao. I am a 23-year-old media arts and Asian studies student at California State University, Chico. Chico is one of the few cities in California that has a large population of Hmong people. In the spring of 2012, I came to the conclusion that I was slowly losing my cultural heritage, my identity as a Hmong person. With the help of a very supportive professor, I set out on an adventure to retrace that heritage and to search for answers.
She was still nervous because she says, but there's a problem. You can't really talk to my dad because he doesn't speak English. I said, D, I'll take care of it, don't worry. We can talk to each other, don't worry. We'll speak in Thai. And she said, I don't know if he speaks Thai or Lao. I said, he does. And so that was how we arranged to get this whole project going.
Namyao là tỏ âm phơ pua này, Mông tỏ lú âm phơ pua tỏ Bắc Cang này, Mông thì Mông như vậy.
Bắc Cang là bốc.
Mông, you're Pastor Mông. Is that a Mông word?
Huh?
What is that?
Many. It's a Thai word. Yeah.
Too much.
Thinking back on that first meeting, I realized how clueless I was about where my parents came from and their journey through the refugee camps of Thailand. It took one professor and a trip to Laos and Thailand for me to realize this. The first time my parents met Professor Waters, who is a sociology professor and the Asian studies advisor at Chico State, they were able to speak to one another without any language barriers. This surprised me. They spoke a combination of Lao, Thai, and English, and were able to communicate smoothly. My family immigrated to the United States when I was 5 years old. I was born in a refugee camp in northern Thailand called Banvinai. My original goal on this trip was to document where and how Hmong refugees lived when they were in Thailand. I forgot that my parents were also refugees. My goal from then on was to document where my parents lived and how they lived before I was born. This was my first time visiting the camps where my parents lived, where I was born, and it was also the first time I visited my uncles and their families in Laos. It became a trip about self-discovery and what it means to be a family. One of my uncles in Laos said that a family is like a tree. A tree is not a true tree unless it has branches. And we are those branches. So we must learn to love and care for one another, no matter how far apart we are.
Nó có bố lụt thái à, chị chơi nó đứa bố lụt thái chị chơi liền.
Tell me that you're going to speak Thai to them. And they'll know, and so I don't have to speak Hmong.
So I'm going to translate for you, for your relatives?
Yeah.
No. Are you afraid to speak Hmong here?
A little bit.
The Hmong people are tribal minorities scattered all over the border regions of China, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. My parents are Hmong people from the Laos regions. The Hmong in Laos became involved with the United States during the Vietnam War.
There was a very serious civil war in Laos. It was a sideshow a bit to the war in Vietnam. The Americans lined up with the Royal Lao government. The Ho Chi Minh and the communists challenged that government. They created an army that included many of the people of Laos. Hmong traditionally lived on top of the mountains, and both sides tried to sweep them into their armies. The one that was more effective at doing it was the Royal Lao government side, which was backed up by the United States CIA.
มีการรอท้อที่ในพุ่นบ้านมีการถนนกุชิโยกุชิเป้าเตียชีกุเป้ากูสังสื่อเจมั่วพอตัวก็เยอะมัวท่าเจก็ยังงานตัวจับพอนินเดหรอกเจกุเป้าทนเดอ
There are no American combat forces in Laos. We have been providing logistical support and some training for the neutralist government.
The United States CIA instead recruited Hmong men to fight in a secret army. In return, the CIA promised to help the Hmong families involved to escape Laos if it fell under communist power.
chỉ có giờ chỉ có giờ nó lầu có giờ vị Thái rồi chỉ có giờ lầu nó này ba rồi xứ chế thôn tới mà đi mua cho cụ cho brother cụ cho tí lồng mua lo khổ bỏ thì đi cho cái tí mua chế mua Indo thôn nó cụ chừng dâu cụ bỏ nhung ya tôi chờ hỗ bê lúc thằng xin mì chế hai tia yếu thâu lỡ một cỡ xứ nữa chế ô cha mù ta rồi chế cha chỉ lò đi chế mù chế mù tua tan đã đi.
First Vietnam fell, and then Laos and Cambodia fell to the communist government. And at first in Laos, they kind of said, okay. General Vong Pao and his immediate leadership became refugees. They went to the United States. But most of the Hmong states said, okay, the other side won the war. We'll just see what happens. We want to go back to farm. We're glad there's peace. We hope they leave us alone. And they didn't leave them alone.
Basically, kia tọt hai rong chế lúc có tài liệu chỉ sâu đi kia cho xe tóm mà nó xứ chị kia tọt hai rong chế một xí sâu ok chị để một thái tiêu nó chị sẽ được chị đi lò xứ mà lò cái tơ lò ít lì thì lò sò thái tiêu.
And the fighting persecution emerged again.
Cô chỉ hay là cho lo tiêu một ta hạ và bỏ tiêu tua ta rồi cho yêu chỉ cho một nhá là tua chỉ nhá là hay là nó cho lo tiêu một và bỏ ta hạ tua lỡ chỉ cho nó như nông và bỏ nó chỉ nhá là một bé tua chỉ giờ thì cho bé kia tua thái tiêu.
Fear of prosecution compelled the Hmong people in Laos to flee their homes and take refuge in neighboring countries, one of which was Thailand.
I lived in Thailand from 1980 to 83, and I started off by being a Peace Corps volunteer in a province called Pra, which is where Dee and Dagmar and I visited. We actually visited old friends that I had from my Peace Corps days. There I worked in the malaria zone office. I didn't work with refugees yet. Jean and Mary Long are missionaries. They came to Thailand, I believe, in 1979 with the intent to spend their whole career there working with a group of people who had a language that nobody else could speak and where the Bible had never been written. In 1980 or 81, they were assigned to Pra, where I was in the Peace Corps. It was the natural place when Dee came along. I said, Jean, can you help this student out? She said, sure. And then I told him we'd like to go back to Namyao. I didn't know whether he'd offer to use the car. I didn't expect him to, really. I figured we'd just figure it out ourselves. But no, he said, I want to go do this. And so we just made a great kind of traveling team.
Along with Jean, Mary, and Dagmar, Professor Waters' wife, we set out to find the first refugee camp that my family lived in, Camp Namyao.
Lo trên tư đi ta thác của bọn nó tới trường lò nè trên lo trên lo bỏ nơi trên chỉ đi dù là nó bị nhỏ nó sẽ chỉ lọ thế này
giờ tiền lại đâu có gì tiền còn lỡ sau đang thấy tuần nó bé bó sẽ là ba cái tin nó lăng từ nhẹ cũ lăng từ nhẹ cũ nó chỉ là sẽ đợi tiền tua chứ tua cho cái gìจะให้กูtiền cóกูbó là cái gì chỉ qua cái gì tiền ở nhà nó có họ cóกูbó có mà bây giờ ít chữ chỉ nhau này lúc rải mùa này chỉ có chỉ qua tiền nó có nhau cũng lúc rải mùa rồiกูchỉ tiền có gì đừng xài nó có chắp lợn
Ban Namyao, or Camp Namyao, is located in Nan Province in Thailand. According to the United Nations, in 1979, there were about 13,366 refugees in this camp. This was also the camp that Professor Waters worked in for 4 months as a Peace Corps volunteer. I wanted to see the places where my parents lived so I could learn to understand the mind of a refugee and the type of decisions they had to make to live every day. When we arrived at the former camp of Namyao, what surprised me the most was that after 30 years, even Professor Waters did not recognize the camp he had worked in. In 30 years, the location where the camp used to sit had become a forest.
And I said, I know there must be buildings here, because this is where the one part of the camp where the refugees lived in buildings. They had concrete blocks. Most of the camp had been bamboo and grass, and that had burned, probably the first season that the people moved out. But how do you get rid of, concrete blocks? And so we had started poking around looking for the concrete blocks, and eventually we found them. And I have lots of pictures in my mind, but I couldn't stick them to the landmarks that were there today.
It took us 2 days to explore the former camp of Namyao. On the first day, we searched for the camp based on what Professor Waters could remember. We found a trail that led into the entrance of the Mian stone houses. Professor Waters has spent those 4 months working with the Mian and the Hmong.
And then there was 2 or 3 rows, I think just 2 rows.
He explained to me that the Mian came to the refugee camp first, so they lived in the cement buildings that were built there. The Hmong people came later and were given straw and bamboo to build their houses. About 70% of the population was Hmong, 10% was Mian, and 20% was Tien.
But there's no snakes under there. Let's see, there's the other wall. The next family goes from here over there.
Are they right next to each other?
Yeah, they were, for the Mian, they were right next to each other.
Oh, it's gonna rain. Unable to travel further due to the weather, we went to look for a store that my father had told us about that sat across from the camp. We were able to ask the store owner to be our guide.
We found a guide who had been there when the camp was there, who was Thai. And he said, sure, come by tomorrow morning, I'll take you up and around and we'll show you the camp. And so he took us into some of the back paths, and we actually followed the boundary of the camp all the way up, because what the Thai government has done is they've kept title to the area where the camp was and let the trees grow. Nobody's allowed to farm there. Just outside of it, there are farms. So the land's been cleared by Thai farmers, and they use it to farm maize.
Our plan was to go see a water tower that Professor Waters had helped put up while working in this camp.
When I would do that, I would go straight up in the middle of the camp. Well, that was so overgrown now we couldn't go. So we went around the side, and I knew up there, I remember having seen a lot of Hmong graves.
This is all it, but it's all overgrown right now, and it's hard to see the actual graves.
My own reaction was, I'm not that spooked by graves. I've been around graves my whole life. And in the traditions I have from the United States, it's a grave is just a rock on the... Yeah, it's kind of spooky when you're a kid that there's a body underneath there. But, Dee had grown up in the shaman tradition, and she had not really expected that. I had told her that this might happen, but she didn't say anything. But when she got up there, my wife said, boy, Dee was really spooked.
Walking past the graves, I was afraid we had missed a Hmong ceremonial protocol for visiting graves.
I think the weirdest place was when we got up to the water tower, and we saw a whole row, just grave after grave after grave.
Jean commented on the fact that the people that were buried on this hill will be forgotten in 10 to 20 years. I realized then that the people here and the history of the Hmong people that lived here will also be forgotten if future children of the Hmong people forget where their parents and ancestors came from, if they forget the many branches of their family tree.
Yeah, you can see it there. See
That's where we go?
Yeah.
Oh, I see where we go. I can see it. And you can tell them all where you walked.
Thì dạ lên mua đồng đó lúc xuân chế cho nó chứ UN là sai chỉ tàn.
Chế mà nó là thế li họ chế giờ lên đó pin này nó giờ ít lui dân trò lo chế chia sẻ được sâu trong đại có tạo chế biết thiết là một nhớ được pin này.
Bây giờ sẽ được lọt ta rồi pin này thôi bây giờ là pin này chế là sao cho tạo số tuổi là đồ nan nhỏ chế hậu nan nhỏ chế là sao là đồ nan nhỏ chế cho thầu cơ chế là số sao cho số tuổi ổn định rồi pin này chế là mà sao bây giờ tạo cá chế cho nhau tạo số tuổi là sao một nhau khi chuột bây giờ là nan nhỏ là chế bây giờ một nhau rồi khi chị
sa pe một số vin này chỉ tan cho lúc sụn vin này chỉ một bao chục phá tụ.
Banvinai was one of the camps where programs of repatriations and resettlement were initiated. It was a transit center. This was also the camp where I was born and the last camp that all my relatives lived in before being dispersed to different corners of the world.
The name Banvinai means it was part of the village of Banvinai. And like Namyao was part of the village of Namyao. So that even when the Hmong refugees moved away, there's still a village called Banvinai, but it's Thai. It's not Hmong, it's not Lao, it's not refugee. So that's what's here now, and that's where we are. There's probably a few hundred people in this village, but there were 40,000 refugees. So they were the bigger part of the village for 15 or 20 years. But we're trying to find out where that big part was, and we can't find it yet. It's just hiding.
I had hoped to travel to the location of Banvinai to see if I would remember anything from my childhood. When I found that I could remember nothing, I realized that I came all this way hoping to find a connection with my birthplace, to find out who I really am. But what I found was much more important than this location that has no trace of me. I found a stronger connection between my parents and myself. My parents had to transition from living in refugee camps in Thailand to living in a house in the United States with no prior knowledge of the English language. Yet, they've been able to raise all 12 of my siblings and I. I came to understand and respect my parents for their sacrifices.
Level stuff, that used to be housing. See the pile of rubble there? That's cement? That's from the housing.
I also found a piece of Hmong history that I did not know about. At Camp Vinai, we found a Hmong cultural temple. During the war, a messiah figure emerged in the Hmong community here in Banvinai.
But it was a teacher who emerged in the 1950s and 1960s. He invented a Hmong alphabet to write the Hmong language. And then about 1972, he was actually killed. Unless you have some kind of connection, there's not much to see. It's just another hillside with a bunch of ruins on it and kind of a weird Hmong temple in the middle. Why would you go to a refugee camp? When the man at Banvinai said that D was the youngest one to ever come visit, that was where his surprise was coming from. Mostly he sees older people who are trying to connect, trying to understand their life. They're 70 years old, they're 60 years old, they're 50 years old. They're not fitting in well in America maybe. Why would someone who fits in well in America come back here, I guess?
At the time we visited this temple, I was as surprised by it as everyone else. I had never heard of this. Due to the high volume of refugees in Thailand, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, and the Thai government implemented repatriation and resettlement programs. From Camp Vinai, after a series of interviews, a refugee family was either sent to a detention center called Camp Nampon, where there was no hope of resettlement, or to a processing center called Pananikom, where they would be sent to resettle in Western countries.
Cho một sập để cho chọn tới một chế gì do cho và chỉ mua tới mình trong lo chế cho cá họ cho mua tới mình chế để phụ tua.
And those who were finally approved, they would spend anywhere from a month to a couple of years going through this process in Pananikom, were then sent to Bangkok, put on an airplane, and brought to the United States and assigned to a particular city.
For some Lao refugees, though, resettlement was not an option. They wanted to be repatriated. My grandfather was one of these refugees.
Giờ chỉ sao tua, giờ chỉ nhẹ, giờ những cho giờ lúc tết chậm lo, ở dù giờ tết cả tua. Bé sao thì một tí giờ chỉ tao rong một tí giờ nhua giờ khử giờ bé tua.
We drive to Chiang Khon, where we took a boat across the Mekong River to the city of Hua Sai, Laos, where my uncles will be picking us up. Although it's been 17 years since I've seen my relatives, I never knew that they lived in Laos. Since I was born in Thailand, I assumed they live in Thailand. As we crossed the Mekong River, which borders Thailand and Laos, it amazes me how much courage and endurance the Hmong people have. When Hmong people were fleeing from Laos, many of them had to cross the Mekong River to seek refuge in Thailand. They lost many of their family members crossing the Mekong. I didn't know it then, but this was the beginning of the 3 most stressful days of this trip. Professor Waters has said that meeting the people who are alive was much more fun than seeing the graves of people who had died. I just did not realize how emotionally stressful it was going to get meeting strangers who were part of my family tree. Although they were strangers, they were family, and they looked like my family. If my parents had not made that decision to immigrate to the United States, this is where I would have lived. With Professor Waters, Dagmar, and I in the back, along with my relatives, we drove 2 hours up the mountain to visit my uncle's village.
We're here.
I found out that the house my uncle Sang now lives in is the same house they helped my grandfather build when they were moved back to Laos. I was able to visit them for only a couple of hours, but I filmed as many relatives as I could so that my parents could see how they were doing. When my parents first immigrated to the United States, they would send cassettes with audio messages to our relatives in Laos. That was their equivalent of a letter since they did not know how to write in Hmong. Each of my relatives allowed me to film them so I could take a video message to my parents. Sadly, our time in Laos came to an end. On this journey full of questions, I only found a few answers and discovered many new questions. What exactly happened when Hmong refugees were repatriated? How did my family stay connected with each other after being separated by miles of ocean? I guess sometimes it is better to know some of the questions than all of the answers. I am ready to continue searching for answers.